Question 1. John Locke describes government as an agent allowed sovereignty over society in order to protect natural human rights. He justifies this by describing a state of nature as one where humans have full sovereignty over themselves, with the right to life, liberty, and property. He then argues that in nature some people violate others' rights, and for this reason government was established to prevent that. Individuals in the society merely allocate their rights to government in order to ensure their rights are protected. Is this view of government, and is this a correct view of government? And are people justified in revolting against a government that fails to protect or attacks human rights? Are there any underlying assumptions in this view, and are they correct? It's a bit of a loaded question, but it will appear in text, so you can try and break it down as you read it. So what do you guys think about John Locke's view of government and of rights? And of the state of nature?
I would say it's pretty much obviously wrong.
Great. Care to elaborate?
No, I'm just kidding, sure. So, I mean, I think a great sort of reference material here would be Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. And he kind of outlines a similar progression in our ideas of, like, what is good versus what is bad or evil. Mm-hmm. But the phenomenon is the same here, where essentially the stated purpose of something is invented after that thing comes into existence itself. So, for example, punishment, exacting sort of revenge of, like, the government, which is one of the things the government does. It penalizes people for breaking the law. That whole phenomenon came before the idea of sort of reforming criminals or even just preventing crime. The same thing applies here. The fact that the government these days might claim to champion people's human rights doesn't mean that's why government came into being, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's even the primary purpose of government.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very valid criticism. I think, sadly, would also apply to, well, all of the other questions, and we'll get to those. But I think definitely on that level, all of the political philosophy developed during the Enlightenment, even though it may have inspired revolutions or formations of new nations, it often really described reality through a different lens rather than create reality. Because obviously government preceded, well, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and all of the philosophers that we'll talk about. Do you think, though, that, looking beyond that, obviously, as someone living in a society under a government, let's take one of the easiest questions to attack here. So, are you justified, say, in revolting against a government that violates your rights? And also more, I guess, let's go even deeper than that. What justifies the power held by government, if anything?
Well, I guess for the first question, I think really all it would come down to for me is, I guess the degree to which I disagree with, like, the government's policies, and, like, a government, I think, can be, like, pretty bad before, like, you're justified in, like, revolting against it or anything. But once it gets, like, so bad, at least in my view, like, yeah, I think the people have every right to revolt.
If you can get enough people together to do a revolt, that's probably a red flag that your government's not really doing its best work, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Five red flags that you might be living in a totalitarian state.
I mean, the thing is, I think there's two different interpretations to that. One is, obviously if the majority of people are unsatisfied, say, with the government, that isn't necessarily an indication that the government isn't justified, but it's a pretty good correlation. I think it's a pretty good hint that there might be something corrupting state of Denmark, however the saying goes. But that might be a good indication. Or you could say a government that doesn't have enough of a police force and can't stabilize order enough, so that a revolution against it can occur, isn't justified. I think that goes more into Thomas Hobbes, which we'll get to later. But sort of, a government is justified by force. I think that's another interpretation. But then, do you think if enough people want to revolt against the government, is that a justification for that revolution, or is there something else that might happen beforehand to make it a worthwhile or justified revolution?
I guess for
I
me,
like how
it's
we both
only
start with
it's only really about whether or not I agree with the revolution. Like, I don't ever think like a communist revolution is justified. You know,
Mm.
it would only be what I think, what I agree with, and like if the government that is like above us is like dysfunctional and espouses like doctrines that aren't that I disagree with, then yeah, I don't see why a revolt wouldn't be justified.
So is it sort of... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I think there's a difference between any kind of revolution being justified and a revolution being justified. Like, if a revolution is happening, I feel like something was probably systemically wrong with the government at the beginning. That doesn't mean that the revolution that's going to, insert the government that's going to be taking the place of the original government is right. But yeah.
Sorry, sorry about that. But so Mark, I guess, I think I'm sensing sort of a position. Let me know if it is your position, because I think it'll be interesting to talk about it. But do you think there's anything special about revolutions, or are they sort of one more political tool available, hopefully to be used in rare occasions because they're quite violent? But are they sort of justified like any other political tool?
Yeah, I would say it is. Yeah, it's not. I don't view it as really special. It's just like kind of the check that the people have on the government. That the people have the numbers. They ultimately fund the government through taxes, and the people are armed as well. And yeah, when the people disagree with the government, then and the government's not functioning, then yeah, revolt is in order.
I would almost take an agnostic approach. I would say the revolution is justified depending on if it wins. Like there's a difference between sort of a revolution and the Civil War. Like, a revolution is just a civil war that one particular side wins, right? Like, we could think of like the U.S. Civil War as a war for independence, or like a revolution of the South, only we don't conceptualize it as such because the Union was preserved, right? So, but that's not to say that these days necessarily everybody in the South thinks that the revolution wasn't justified, or that if they had won, that we still wouldn't think that it's justified. But it's just to say that I don't even necessarily think it's a good question to ask if a revolution is justified. Just because if we're going to go with the idea of sort of government as justified by the consent of the governed, sure, the people are sort of violently establishing their discontent with the government, but there's also everyone on the other side. Like, it's not like the small minority of people that are actually in positions of power aren't backed up by sort of large amounts of force and people that represent sort of that whole structure. So I think to say that it's like somehow philosophically justified misses the point, that it's really about two sort of structures vying for dominance, and whichever one wins will become the new government.
That's pretty funny. I would think, that's not how I would approach it, but I think I'm the only one so far who hasn't at least concurred with John Locke. I haven't asked, what do you think of John Locke yet, but I think from what I've heard so far, it seems like, I don't know, I haven't gotten much of a sense from Clara's answer, but I think from Mark and Peter, I think you both basically disagree fundamentally with the theories of John Locke, right?
I think you got some
Yeah.
things right, but the whole idea of the purpose of government doesn't seem accurate to me.
Right, that's why it's sort of like concurring, because I think everyone but me, I actually disagree with that, but I think everyone but me sort of concurs that revolutions are justified, but we all have different justifications for them, I guess. Sort of, Claire, do you justify them by saying, I guess, if enough people want to revolt, that a revolution will be successful, then it's probably justified for some reason in the current state?
I would
Yeah.
not say that.
I'd say that.
Wait, Peter, so were you saying that it's not about
I'm saying that
justification, it's just about...
It's not really about justification.
Mhm.
It's really just about success. And just because the people that are on one side of the argument have more guns doesn't necessarily mean that they're more justified. But in a way, whether the revolution is justified is immaterial and undecidable. Because Mark talked about some sort of standard where, like, if you disagree with the government, you can revolt, but only if the government is like really wrong, with the implication being that if it's only slightly wrong, then maybe an approach of reform might be better. Personally, I think if the government doesn't support the way that you want to butter your bread, and that's the hill that you're willing to die on, then go for it.
I
But
guess
don't be
I should...
surprised when you get guns down
I
in the street
wouldn't.
either.
Yeah, I'm not taking like a moralistic stance, really. Like, I don't think it's really wrong to do it, to revolt ever, really. I'm just looking at it more in a pragmatic way. Like, usually I think reform's probably a better way of getting what you want in most circumstances. And like, as for like how you justify like a revolt, it's like I do. Like, in a sense, I think I do agree with Peter that, like, power in itself is justifying to an extent. But also, really what it comes down to for me is, like, pure ideology, really. Like, I just find it's just really a means to an end for me. Yeah.
So then, I guess we're going a bit far from John Locke, so after this I'll try to, sort of, I guess, either we'll move on to the next question, or we'll try to dive back deeper into his ideas. But if I rephrase this a bit, let's say, 'cause I'm just curious at this point, I'll ask this an open question for everyone. At what point do you think the government has gone too far for you to risk your own life? And go up in arms. If you think that there's any chance at all of success, you'll just go and try to revolt. Like, what would make you? I'm assuming there's some bar. Like, I'm assuming it's not actually bread and butter. Maybe I'm wrong, but correct me if I'm wrong. What do you think are necessary conditions, not to justify, but at least to cause a revolution for you?
What would the government have to do to get me to challenge them to a physical fight?
Yeah, basically. Asking for a friend. I mean.
See, for me, it's not even a matter of what the government has to do. I mean, maybe there is some line that could be crossed, but really the question is, how is that line crossed? Like, if the government sort of becomes a totalitarian state, sort of like China, then revolution is impossible to, or very difficult to impossible, just because even organizing that sort of thing on a large scale, you're pretty much guaranteed to get shut down, locked in a re-education camp, and never see the light of day again. Right. So really, I think that it's not necessarily about what the government does, so much as the broader social circumstances. Like if it's not necessarily a totalitarian thing, but the country seems to be going in two directions at once, and some sort of civil war seems imminent, then yeah, I might pick up a gun and fight. But if it's already a lost cause, like, I don't necessarily see the point, if that makes sense.
Cool. It's an interesting answer. I like the Civil War component to it. That seems like a pretty pragmatic way to view at least some revolutions. I know like the French Revolution had basically at some point two armies that fought against each other, more so than just random civilians versus a government.
Yeah, because the main example I would give besides China is Nazi Germany, right? Because Nazi Germany had a lot of resistance movements, either peaceful or otherwise, but they were pretty much just all killed, right? And it never really escalated to the point of an actual revolution, just because the government was so efficient at sort of stamping out dissent.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I would try to be up in arms there, but I see the point of it being, well, almost like futile from the beginning. I don't know. What do other people think? What are your, I guess, basic criteria for, this is so bad, it's worth it to risk my life and I'm going to revolt?
I don't really know. It really depends on the a case by case basis, I guess. I think I largely agree with what Peter says.
Like, honestly, for me, we might have even reached that point. I'm coming to see what Mark's saying a bit more and agreeing with him more. Like, honestly, under different circumstances, the current society that we have might be grounds for a revolution already, but it's just because there's not already a revolution underway, like, it doesn't make sense to start one now.
See, I've been thinking that same thing. Like, it would take really a lot for me to... I don't know under what circumstances I personally would start a revolution, but if one was occurring, I think I would, maybe participate, given the right circumstances. I don't know what kind of issues.
Throw some rocks at police officers.
Yeah, like, I'll join in.
I guess there's really different, the criteria for starting one, criteria for joining one, right? It's not that easy to detect.
I feel like starting one is almost like I'd probably prefer to start one than to join one.
Really?
Because in a sense at least, because the starting one usually involves like writing like an essay or something, trying to like gain influence over people and stuff like that. Like, I'd much prefer to revolt in that way than to, like, pick up a gun and just be, like, a soldier in, like, a revolution.
Well, actually, that's, funnily enough, something that has been bouncing around in my head in this conversation, which is, I think maybe one of the things that is different about today, which precludes it, is that we don't have the sort of right kind of people that could even start a revolution, right? Because that guy that, like, shot up, like, those Muslims in New Zealand, right? Funnily enough, I think he was an Australian native, but his whole ideology was actually around trying to start a revolution / race war in America, right? And essentially, like, the whole thing was, like, influenced by, like, 4chan memes and all that. He's not exactly, like, a George Washington type figure, like Thomas Jefferson or, like, Hamilton, right? But that's sort of, like, I would say a good portrait of the modern revolutionary. Like, I don't think that revolutionaries these days have any sort of nobility of spirit, which is arguably, for me at least, what made the American Revolution work, and actually what made the French Revolution such a disaster.
I mean, when it comes to actual revolutions, I get into this heated debate often with people where I would definitely call the American Revolution an independence war, not a revolution. But I guess it was influenced by John Locke. So if that's the kind of revolution that he was talking about, let's try and dive back into it. I guess his justification was the government only exists to protect your rights. That's the only valid reason, at least, to allow it to exist and to have such power over you. And so if it violates your rights instead of protecting them, then you have to replace it, and replacing it would probably involve force. I guess we could apply it differently nowadays, because he was really just talking about replacing a monarch, right? I don't think he lived in a constitutional monarchy even, or at least at the very least he didn't live in a democracy like the UK today. So I guess would replacing the government by voting out its current members be sort of what he would be going for today, rather than revolution as a means to, I guess, stop the violation of rights? Because, I mean, he was never really, given a democracy to begin with. He was given sort of a government which you could only replace by overthrowing it. So do you think the sort of living in a democracy changes the equation at all?
I think that's a great political comic. So maybe I'll find it and you can put it in the video when you're editing it, not to give you extra work. But it's essentially like a giant like figure. You can only see like the feet like trampling like two people, and one of them is getting trampled by the left foot, and he's like, next election I'll vote Republican, and the one's getting trampled by the right foot, and he says, next election I'll vote Democrat, right? And essentially that's what I think the flaw in the plan is. Like we can be convinced that we're capable of making a difference, when really, regardless of which of the two sort of party candidates we vote for, our rights are going to get violated in some way.
Yeah, I mean, the illusion of choice can be overwhelming sometimes, but at the very least, you could say, if you really didn't trust anyone who's running, in at least our democracy, you could also run. So it's not really electing between two different competing aristocracies, in the sense that, well, you really can, not by blood, but by, well, freedom, I guess I would say, join the aristocracy yourself. Maybe I'm too defensive of American democracy, I don't know. Yeah. Any groundbreaking points? Anyone have anything more to add to John Locke before we move on to Hobbes?
I think one thing we could talk about with John Locke is what he thought about like what actually justifies the government having like power over us in the first place. And John Locke said it was like to defend our rights. I would disagree with that. I think why we need a government is really to uphold virtue. I would view like political philosophy as like a means to implement your ethical philosophy, really.
Interesting. So it's sort of, I think, okay, the third question we'll get to would be Rousseau. I think that's the closest thing to what you just described. It differs quite a lot from John Locke, even though John Locke was influenced by Rousseau. Anything more to add? Comments, questions, or statements before we go on?
I think it's really important that the government supports human rights. I think that's one of the things I do want for it to do, even if it wasn't the original point of government. I do appreciate it. I appreciate the effort.
Oh yeah, I think in that sense,
it's
almost like a religious conviction that I would think is worthwhile to have. So I call it religious because it's sort of like John Locke really describes a false reality when he says that the only reason we have government is to protect rights. But it's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if we all choose to believe that government is only justified when it protects our rights, and it's never justified when it violates our rights, in fact we should, revolt against it if it ever does that, then if enough people have that belief, it sort of becomes true, in the sense that whoever is in power sort of calculates that into the equation and realizes, oh, I better not violate rights because that is what I'm here to protect, or at least enough people would revolt if I don't. So that's an interesting, I guess, point to add to it. I would definitely concur. I also believe the government should protect rights. It's very cool.
And there's one last thing I want to say about kind of the point of government, because I don't think that the only point of government is to protect rights. I think that there's another point where it's like almost to facilitate livability in country. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
I think Rousseau called it harmony.
Culture.
So yeah, there's definitely that aspect as well.
I don't think government itself has a particular purpose. I think it's just something that's inevitable that happens when a bunch of people exist in close proximities. Of course, there's informal power structures, but at some point power is going to become formalized. But then the purpose of that formalized power structure is going to vary drastically from place to place. And I think what you people are describing are all purposes that a government can have as a specific government, but that government itself doesn't really have a purpose in and of itself.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think it's a fundamental critique of Rousseau. I can't bring it up because I think, alright, let's try and real quickly go through Hobbes. We're a bit short on time anyways, but yeah, we'll go through Hobbes, and then as soon as we get to Rousseau, I think that's where the meat of the argument is, because I think it sort of is the basis of the Hobbesian view and the Lockean view, and we can critique sort of the underlying assumptions of both when we critique Rousseau the easiest. Right, so Hobbes. Let's see what I got in him. Question 2. Thomas Hobbes describes the government as an unquestioned, all-powerful sovereign, embodying the will of the governed. He justifies on the premise that the state of nature of humanity is a war of all against all, guided by man's selfish will to survival with little regard to others, and by an inherent will to power. Hobbes argues without a sovereign, these forces lead to a short and brutal life for most, and that giving away the right to self-govern to the sovereign is a worthwhile compromise to ensure safety and well-being in a society. Is this a correct view of government, and should people avoid questioning the government and leave all power to it? Are there underlying assumptions to this view, and are they correct?
I do have a lot of respect for this for Hobbes' view. I think it's a much more honest take than John Locke's. Or I think John Locke is much more concerned with justifying an ideology that he already believed in. Whereas I think Thomas Hobbes it's a good analysis of what government has been since the first government ever existed, which was really to it was a what you would call a monopoly on the use of force to basically make sure the chimps don't kill each other. And I think there is a lot of utility in this type of government, and I think it's much more natural to of how power structures traditionally work in human civilization. Like Thomas Hobbes' view of the state, like you could compare it to like your father and your mother, like they're basically an absolute force on you. And that's traditionally how power structures used to be a lot of the time. Democracy I think is a pretty unnatural organization.
It's interesting that you said the mother and father thing, because I got also like a very familial vibe from this description of government, but almost in more of a you need their support to get through, but sure, they've got some problems, but at the end of the day, you gotta love your government.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting if you look at sort of developmental psychology, just to continue the analogy. Like, it's pretty much a stereotype that, like, people become rebellious during their teenage years. But then the question becomes, like, alright, well, this is a phenomenon that exists in human psychology. Is it useful? And I won't go so far as to make an evolutionary claim, but I think we're pretty justified in assuming that it has some purpose that it serves. And what I would say is that it's wholly beneficial, even if your parents aren't necessarily the kind that justify rebellion, right? Because let's say that your parents aren't sort of the greatest, right? Then it makes sense sort of to rebel from them, either to like break from the trends, like maybe they're like trying to drag you down, prevent you from being successful and whatnot. Then it makes sense to rebel. But the thing is, even if your parents are doing like sort of a great job and like treating you right and like pushing you to succeed and all that, it still makes sense so that you don't become over reliant on them and so that you can become independent. And funnily enough, I think that that the same analogy applies here, only because of sort of our short lifespans, we might not necessarily see the fruits of rebelling against a government that sort of ensures all our rights without being unjust to us. But I think the point here is that such a government isn't necessarily a guarantee, and if people aren't capable of sort of resisting force, whether the force of the government or other external parties, if they're not capable of resisting at all, then should that government come to an end, which eventually, if we look at history, all governments have, even ours is relatively young, right? Then without that sort of fundamental strength of resistance, then we're going to fall prey to the next sort of totalitarian regime that comes along.
Yeah. One interesting thing also is I think like revolutions kind of like I don't know if you could classify Hobbes's view as totalitarian. Probably more so just authoritarian. Like I think kind of this teenage rebellion actually can make these authoritarian governments like even better, because what happens is I think authoritarian governments kind of get too relaxed, I suppose, with keeping their power, and that could result in like really degradation of like and corruption in the system.
Yeah, people want to talk about sort of degradation. I mean, I often cite China as like the prototypical example of a totalitarian state that I do not want to live in. But even if we look at them, I feel like they're facing numerous crises because their whole economic model has been based off constant growth, some of which you can already start to see the excesses of. Like, they have entire cities that they've sort of built which aren't occupied, just because that's sort of the price of keeping all these people that build buildings employed, right? But if we look even further down the road, we're going to see that China currently has a lot of people living in extreme poverty, but as their middle class grows, as their level of sort of standard of living increases, well, their fertility is going to drop, their growth is going to slow, and all of a sudden they're going to have a bunch of people that are getting old and sort of retiring. And what are they going to do about them? I mean, are they just going to start killing them off to prevent them from tanking the economy? I mean, given China's track history, I wouldn't say that that's too far off base of what they would actually do. But then the question becomes, all right, well, it's one thing to support your government when it's like oppressing a bunch of foreigners and like minorities and putting them in camps, but it's another thing when it's like grandma and grandpa and like mom and dad, you know. So maybe that becomes the crisis point where the government is going to break down.
So would that be sort of like I don't know. I guess my main problem with this whole view of government is I think it is the most realistic of the three, of the big three Enlightenment era political science, or rather philosophy, philosophers. I think it still is wrong at its core in some essence about government and its history and its foundation. I guess I would say that it's sort of like over history, we've had an internal struggle for power between people. And you can trace this back to the chimps who, still have like a dominance hierarchy, and they're sort of like fighting over who's going to be the next big chimp chief or whatever. And you can see this like, I think in ancient history with like tribes fighting each other over land or power or resources. And then Thomas Hobbes sort of gives this benefit to a time of peace, which is like a time where the government has become so strong that for, let's say, 50 years or even a century, there isn't any civil war, there isn't any big war between two nations or states, and there isn't any struggle for power as sort of just the justification for having an all-powerful government and sort of submitting to it. In which, in essence, it's almost like when the king, is powerful enough, he sort of establishes, oh, look at all the peace I brought by winning. Never fight me again if you want this kind of peace, right? But then when the king does become weak enough and you can rebel, it's sort of like they use their justification of, look at the 50 years when I could win and everything was fine, keep everything fine by letting me win when I don't deserve it, when I can't actually hold my power. So it's sort of like, I guess, justification by falsifying history, where if you give in to the idea that the struggle for power is bad, at whichever point you do that, whoever is in power just won for life. And I don't think that's necessarily that they deserve to win just because they've been winning for a while.
Well, personally, I would say that it's not about deserving to win, right? Like, there could be somebody that has like the best ideas in the world for how to govern, but if they're not able to win anybody to their side, if they're not able to sort of actually take that control that they need, then at the end of the day, like, sure, it's a shame, but in a sense, I would say that nature will counter despotism. Like, if there's a pretty uniquely terrible ruler, it's not going to be too long until they're overthrown. But the opposite isn't necessarily true. Just because you would be a good ruler doesn't make you automatically worthy. Not necessarily even worthy, but capable of ruling.
Right. Let's see. So are there... so are there any assumptions in this view of government that you think... well, first of all, what do you think are the assumptions, and are they correct? So, what are the assumptions behind, sort of the... I guess if I want to try and summarize the view, because it's a very long question, but to summarize what I interpreted Thomas Hobbes to be saying, and correct me if if you have a different interpretation, you think I'm wrong, definitely do make sure to establish that. But I guess I would summarize it as it's always better for people to allocate control to one entity, because otherwise chaos would ensue, anarchy would ensue, and the state of nature will come about, and the state of nature is necessarily worse than any one particular entity holding power. So do you think, what are the assumptions under this, and are they correct?
Well, I guess what it seems that like Thomas Hobbes values is peace, really, and prosperity, and this is in contrast to Locke, who would think that like in order to have peace and prosperity, You just need like a democratic government, really, because humans aren't like naturally like bad as Thomas Hobbes thinks. So I think a lot of the assumptions with these philosophers boil down to human nature. Locke thinks humans are a blank slate that are basically influenced only by culture. Thomas Hobbes has a much more nature-based view of human nature. He thinks it's based in like biology and stuff. Not biology. I don't know what you would call it. More deterministic by God, probably. And like Rousseau believes that humans are like naturally good.
See, I would say that I would take a little bit more of a nuanced view in that, like, I would say that humans, it depends what you mean by naturally good, because if you're thinking of it in terms of sort of non-agricultural society, then I would say that there's very limited means for people to be like what we would think of as evil, right? Because essentially, right, if you're in sort of a community that is in a state of privation, then you're going to need to cooperate and get along just to survive, right? And that doesn't mean that conflict doesn't happen, but it means that the negative consequences for conflict are going to be so massive that's going to be avoided most of the time. But then when we think of agricultural societies, in a sense, that's the point where our material needs are met to the point where we would even become capable of being evil. So I wouldn't necessarily say that a government is necessary in general, but as soon as there's an organization that's large enough and sort of stable enough that we could think of as society, then yeah, I would think that a government is necessary.
Interesting. I think that's a great segue, unless anyone has anything more to add. That's a pretty great segue to Rousseau, because I think he was also talking about, well, the question reads noble savages. I can try and sort of walk through it, but alright. Any groundbreaking points before we go on? Alright. So, question 3. Jean-Jacques Rousseau describes a government as the executor of the general will. He justifies this by claiming that in the state of nature, humans are noble savages, and that they are corrupted when they live in a civilization. Thus, he argues that in a civilization, a government must execute the general will of the civilization, arrived at by some form of democracy, and that the wills of individuals in a society must be subordinate to the general will. Is this a correct view of government, and should people subordinate their view to the general will? Are there any underlying assumptions in this view, and are they correct? So I think you definitely mentioned some of the things that Rousseau mentions here, which is sort of like, I guess, yeah, in primitive society, right? Like the noble savages, or not in society, but let's say in the tribal settings, where, humans mostly interact with their family or sort of with immediate neighbors, right? There's less of a chance to do things like revolutions or police forces or anything like what we view as the government today. But in a civilization, when there's an excess of resources, and there's sort of like struggle against strangers, almost like people you have no connection with, that's where you sort of need the government to stabilize the society. And then he said also the government must execute the general will, which, come to think of it now, I think is two different claims. So let's break into two different claims and, tell me what you think of either or both. So claim number 1 is civilization inherently necessitates having a government, which kind of goes against the whole anarcho-syndicalism and all of that, right? But that's sort of like We have to have a government if we have too many people living in one place. That's claim number one. Claim number two, if you're going to have a government, the moral government is the one that executes the general will, which is sort of the average wills of people. So what do you guys think about those assumptions? Or I guess those claims, I should say.
I would agree with the first claim, that we do need a government. I think a government is, whether or not it's necessary, I think it's I would prefer it to not having a government, whether or not we have like a lot of people together in a civilization. As for the second claim, no, I don't think the government's job is to execute the theoretical general will of the populace.
Yeah, I would pretty much agree with Mark. I would take it a step further and say that a government is inevitable. I mean, I would say it's just an emergent property of the informal power relations that already exist between people at some level, at some sufficiently large scale. It's pretty much guaranteed to turn into something formalized. And then if we think about the general will, personally I don't buy it, because I don't think it's necessarily justified in that people's wills are constantly shaped by things. And I would say that sort of, whether it's sort of like the media or just like intellectuals, that there's a certain group of people that have an outsized say in what the general will even is. And I would say that's amplified now that we live in sort of the information age, in that sort of the people that control the gateways to information control what gets seen and therefore what gets discussed. So I think the idea of some sort of general will as the justification for government force and some enforcement of that is just completely preposterous.
In regards to the first question, I do kind of want to agree with Peter that government is kind of inherent to large-scale societies, and even if it's not kind of a formal centralized government, there will be kind of operational bodies that provide services, and then over time that'll kind of, shift in maybe a kind of government-like direction. I do think that it's important for the government to kind of serve the general will, even if the general will is kind of very difficult to pin down, or divided, as it often is. Yeah, I do think that it's important as a member of society to be able to kind of make your, voice heard in a way, to kind of be able to participate in the society and inform the rules that are applied to you.
I'm very glad you took that position. I agree with both Peter and Mark, so we gotta have at least some, topic of.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna take that position as well, just to be a devil's advocate. In fact, I will take the contrary position on the first claim, just so that we can generate some interesting discussion. But I'm glad that someone actually holds a different, view, and there's actually gonna be genuine disagreement. That's definitely important.
Yeah, man, wisdom of doubts.
Right. I guess. Well, not even. It's just. I think he made a small leap in describing governments, and I think everyone else built on top of his sort of basic. I'm actually not sure. General will is a bit more disputed, I guess, but it's definitely a less of a jump than, say, natural rights or preservation of peace and harmony. So, okay, I'll try to take the contrary position on the first one, and then we can talk about. Convince each other of the other point, basically. So, the first assumption, here's one scenario that I guess I would use sort of to disprove the rule that having a civilization big enough, you also have to have a government to regulate it. What if, we started what did Isaac call this on nation states? I think it was the Ansin paradise, right? What if we started a paradise that consisted of nothing but ideologically motivated, perfectly moral actors, or at least mostly those, right? Where people sort of realize the evils inherent in government and oppression and power, and all agreed, we're going to be nice to each other, we're going to cooperate, we're going to, share all resources equally. So if you see anyone hoarding up land or great amounts of resources, you tell others and you sort of acquiesce that material back. And as long as enough people operate on basic principles and enforce them when they see others who don't, that could sort of be a government of the people in the most basic sense that it would be everyone belonging to one big police force enforcing the ideas of an ideology. Could that be sort of like, if that existed, could it exist? And if so, would that be disproving the claim that there must be a government because civilization is too unstable otherwise?
See, Dan, the first thing that made me think of is like that famous quote from the Federalist Papers. I just pulled it up right now. So the first part of it is, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And also, if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. So, I think, yes, what you're describing would be feasible if men were angels, if everyone could be trusted to sort of carry out the mandate of this sort of non-governmental government. But I don't think that's the case at all.
So it's sort of like... sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in addition to that, I think that kind of scenario isn't feasible in a way that it would provide for the opportunity of the development of an informal power structure.
I think, though, that in anarcho-syndicalism, they aren't exactly even against a government per se. They're against an unjust hierarchy, and that doesn't, and to them at least, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have a government. I guess I don't know how you would. It's like basically they're for a government so long as it's good, essentially. I think, but it's because when I was talking to Isaac, I think what he was saying, he was making claims based on in the government, how a anarcho-syndicalist society would form is you have a bunch of worker co-ops, right? And rather than a capitalist company, and then he, in his view, they would function much better than capitalist companies. And then the traditional state would kind of just wear away because we don't really need it. And then after that, they would form a federation of workers cooperatives, and that is a government, but it's not a government based on what he would call unjust hierarchies, I guess.
It's interesting that you bring up sort of the idea of these co-ops, because I think a fundamental rule in them is if you don't like what decisions they come to, you can just leave. And I think that aligns with a lot of sort of right-wing thought, as in one of the central topics is the right to exit, right? Which is essentially if you don't agree with the decision that your government makes, that's not necessarily a problem as long as you can opt out. But it's interesting that sort of the far left and the far right have convergence on this issue.
Well, I think that sort of touches upon an interesting point that I think is a critique of a lot of these philosophers. I think both John Locke and Thomas Hobbes kind of base their philosophy on Rousseau's idea of the social contract, which is there's a contract we all consented to the contract of giving your power to the state in order to ensure, your rights or harmony or the general will, whatever piece of that it would be. But it's sort of like an invalid contract, or at least the critique goes, it's an invalid contract, because you never really get to consent. In a sense, rarely in history did you have the opportunity to leave if you didn't like what your current state was doing. I mean, if we talk about like ancient Greece, if they would catch you outside of town, not the town that you're a citizen of, but sort of a different town would catch you sort of trying to immigrate somewhere else, oftentimes you would just be abducted as a slave or something. So I mean, it's not like you could really immigrate between different states and sort of choose to exit. And even in modern times, to think about it, we had the Berlin Wall. That was a glaring example of the oppressive regime wouldn't just let you leave, because if they would, then there wouldn't be an oppressive regime. Everyone would just leave, right? So is it sort of like I guess a cop-out, or sort of an invalid argument to claim, no matter what the government does, it's okay, you could just leave, when in reality it doesn't seem like that's really been an option, or maybe even is an option in most bad government areas today.
Well, I think there's certain factors which will preclude that as an option, right? Because the question becomes, well, where are you going to go? You could end up becoming like a refugee and not really have any place that you can end in this sort of a secure environment. But I think the main point in here is that one of the hallmarks of a unjust system is one that does not secure the right to exit. Like, there's always going to be a question of, okay, well, sure, you can leave, but where exactly are you going to go? But I think the point here is that if you can't leave, then that is a definite sign that there's something wrong.
Bit of a red flag.
Right.
Top 5 red flags you're living in a totalitarian regime.
When consent is implied and you can't choose not to consent later, that's probably it.
Yeah.
I remember there's this Key and Peele skit where like these two guys are like accosting another guy on the plane, and he's like, "Feel free to say no. I will not take no for an answer."
That's that's a pretty funny way of putting it. Yeah. I guess if there's any outtake, I would agree within the Enlightenment era philosophy of government is there should always be an exit. I don't know if that's exactly what they were going for, but the social contract seems to be, you should be able to consent or not consent to it. So I would definitely agree with that point. Any groundbreaking points?
All right. Yeah.
Oops, sorry.
I guess one groundbreaking point, I guess, is I think I disagree with the I don't agree with like consent being a valid justification for government. I think I see that as kind of a more nihilistic, in my view of what justifies something. Because when you justify something, you're making a moral claim, really. And so I think what really justifies a government is if the government's able to make the society more virtuous. I think is my standard for whether a government is justified. And of course, like, you can leave. I'm not gonna like force you to be in the country, but I don't think you should necessarily. Voting is not a prerequisite for a government. If anything, would be a more pragmatic end to a virtuous society.
Yeah, just to sort of expand on Mark's point about consent not really being a good basis, I think that's like the fundamental error of libertarianism in general, because consent is pretty much a standard to establish when some action is not justified because it was like unconsenting parties. But in and of itself, it's not enough to justify an action either, right? Like, just because somebody agreed to do something doesn't mean that it was correct, right? Like, for example, right, if we think of sort of like democracy as the consent of the governed, but wait, it's not everybody that consents, it's just the majority. Like, Hitler was democratically elected, right? And of course he sort of consolidated control from there, but at least to begin with, that would mean that Hitler was justified, right? So
I mean,
really,
obviously the majority can be wrong, and even the entirety can be wrong, right? So
I think it's a special case because I don't think Hitler won the majority.
no, I think he
vote
was
with it.
appointed. But I see the point. I mean,
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
So-
yeah, even theoretically, right? Like, if a government was voted in and did something terrible, like, it wouldn't be justified, right?
Yeah, it's my understanding that Hitler had support of 1/3, right? Approximately.
Yeah, I believe it was the Nazi. Yeah, I think you're right because the Nazi Party was voted in some respects, and then he was appointed from
Yeah.
there. But it's still, you can
like-
establish a causal chain from sort of the will of the people to Hitler's appointment,
Mhm.
and see it doesn't exactly justify him.
I think even more. I think fundamental example, without even the government involved, right? Because I definitely see your point on consent not being enough to justify an action. So if someone wanted to kill themselves, right, and they came up to you and said, you know, hired you to kill them, you wouldn't be justified, I think, at least in my opinion, to kill them just because they consented to it, even if they wanted it, right? So it's sort of like, at least that's my opinion of it. But, you know, I think even if you don't agree with that, we can go to a different case what you would, in the sense that if you can think of something truly evil to do, it doesn't matter if whoever you're doing it to consents or agrees or even wants it, it could still be evil.
Yeah.
Any groundbreaking points?
No.
Alrighty. Well, this has been the Enlightenment. Thanks for being here.
The Unlightenment.
The Unlightenment. Well, this has been the Enlightenment episodes of the Enlightenment podcast. Alright, we'll be back next week.